It's 2026 and there are no shortage of tasks in front of the Massachusetts Legislature. But how does its to-do list square with municipal leaders and advocates' priorities? I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. This is our second start of the year roundtable. In 2025, I talked with a Bay State mayor and 2 advocacy groups, and we're shuffling up the guests, but sticking with that general assortment now. So today I'm joined by Lynn Mayor Jared Nicholson, Jennie Williamson, State Director for Research and Advocacy Organization, the Education Trust in Massachusetts, and Clark Ziegler, who, as you're hearing this, is still Executive Director of the quasi-public Massachusetts Housing Partnership, but he will be retiring after 4 decades at the helm in just about a month to be succeeded by Rachel Heller. Well, thank you all so much for joining me. I'm going to have you sort of go around in a circle and introduce yourself so our listeners can get familiar with your voices. Let's start with you, Mayor.
Good morning. I am the mayor of Lynn. I just started on Monday my second term, 4-year term. And I also want to point out, for the record, that I went to high school with Jennie.
I didn't know you were going to reveal that information, Mr. Mayor.
The world of Massachusetts is the size of a pea, I always realize here. All right, Jennie, you're up then.
Hi, my name is Jennie Williamson, and I am the State Director of Ed Trust in Massachusetts. Ed Trust is a national organization, but we have a chapter here in Massachusetts as well.
And Clark.
Hi, I'm Clark Ziegler. I'm Executive Director of the Massachusetts Housing Partnership. We're a public nonprofit organization, and we finance affordable housing and advocate for more housing, and I've been doing this work for decades.
Okay, so we are here halfway through the legislative term, because we've got these 2-year cycles here in Massachusetts, to talk about what you would like to see from state leadership from all of your individual perspectives. So I think maybe if we start looking ahead by actually looking back over the last year, because that can sort of give us a cue as to what state leaders are interested in and whether it aligns with what you are personally interested in. Clark, why don't we go in reverse here? From a housing perspective, what moves have you been seeing from state lawmakers in the housing space, and has it sort of been proportionate to what the need seems to be right now?
There's much more work to be done. I think folks are aware that there were some major legislative wins over the last few years, including the MBTA Communities Act, the major housing bond bill that included legalized accessory dwelling units statewide. A lot of positives, but at the same time, the housing trends are really discouraging. We have housing production last year looks like it'll be the 12-year low. So there's enormous unmet need to promote housing development and to remove barriers to new housing.
And then Jennie, in the education space, it's obviously been an interesting few years. I'm referring, for those who have not been paying attention, to a ballot measure that changed the way that Massachusetts manages its graduation requirements, namely that you can no longer use the 10th grade MCAS as a graduation requirement in Massachusetts high schools. So with that in mind, what's been consuming your last year on the state policy level?
Yeah, well, I think in addition to the ballot question, that is a major question that legislators and policymakers are going to have to address in the coming year. What does it mean to graduate with a high school diploma here in Massachusetts? But I think the broader issue we're facing here in Massachusetts is that we're constantly patting ourselves on the back for being number one in education. But when you look beyond the state averages, there is a much more complicated and frankly troubling story that emerges. And that is that we're really only number one for some. A child's educational opportunity still depends far too much on their zip code and their family's income. And we have some of the widest educational gaps in the nation, gaps that are constantly leaving students of color and students from low-income backgrounds behind. Now, the good news is we do have a legislature and an administration that does prioritize education, and I think genuinely cares about closing these gaps. We've seen record investments in K-12 and higher education in recent years, and a real focus on supporting our highest need students, which is really important progress. I don't want to understate that. But I think the challenge is that despite these investments, the outcomes just simply aren't improving at the pace we need. And yes, the pandemic set us back. It absolutely disrupted learning, put a huge strain on school systems, and intensified things like student mental health needs, and the list goes on. But I think it's now 6 years since the pandemic started, and I think 2026 needs to be the year that we stop treating these challenges as insurmountable and really start demanding better results for our kids. And I think that starts with getting back to the basics.
All right, Mayor, walk me through the last year in Lynn. What did you want? What did you get?
Well, we have had, I think, really great partners with the Haley Driscoll administration. Cares a lot about gateway cities and our priorities, which are priorities that have been talked about already with education and housing. I think that we have a great legislative delegation and have appreciated a lot of the support that we've gotten. One of the big issues that remains to be tackled is municipal revenue and the limitations that municipalities experience in trying to provide the services that our residents rely on. We've really had an incredible level of investment in our operating funds for education with the Student Opportunity Act, but that in some ways has even increased the pressure on municipalities to be able to keep up with their local contribution. And because of the limitations on our ability to bring in revenue with Proposition 2.5, and because of the really intense cost pressures from categories that we really don't have much control over in terms of our pension obligations and particularly the cost of health insurance and providing healthcare for our employees, it really constrains the municipal finance, and that pressure is just getting worse.
And to dive in on that a little bit, because it can sometimes be helpful as a slight primer for people who might not be familiar with the Massachusetts home rule system of government here. If you in Lynn would like to see something change, you are only able to do so much on your own. A lot of the time you have to come to the state legislature and ask them to essentially allow you to make changes, alter your basic structure. You mentioned, of course, the limitations of Prop 2.5. So how has the last year gone, essentially, in asking for that partnership and asking for that adjustment? Because the governor is one thing and the legislature can sometimes be another.
Yeah, I mean, the governor and the Haley Driscoll administration, our legislators, they're great partners, but they're dealing with a system and they're operating a system that's really slow, and it's slow by design in a lot of ways. But that really can hamstrung municipal operations. We actually were able to rewrite our charter for the first time in decades here in the city of Lynn, which is super exciting. And so I think that gives us a lot more tools. But there's other ways in which we're limited by how these aspects work. For example, the for us to go out and raise additional revenue beyond the Proposition 2.5, we have to go to the voters for approval, and that includes for big construction projects. Several years ago, we wanted to build a new school to address exactly the kind of disparities that Jennie was talking about that we experience here in the city of Lynn. And because of the limitations of municipal finance, we needed to have a vote to exclude the debt that the new school would bring onto our balance sheet from the limitations. With an impact to voters. This was 2016, 2017. Economy is really strong in one of the most prosperous regions in the world. But you have this working class community that feels like it's taxed too far, and that proposition went down 2-1 in a vote in 2016. And so we lived another decade with a school that is not fit for our students. Fortunately, now we got back on it, and we're going to open that school in 2 years. It's under construction, finding other ways to do it. But that delay has really cost our students and ultimately cost the Commonwealth.
So, Clark, this will be your last, as we're recording, last 2 months, month and a half, helming MHP here. So also to kind of stick with that meta question for a moment, how responsive have lawmakers been over the last cycle compared to your entire tenure at MHP and kind of grappling with that housing crisis?
I think that what some of the steps forward in the last few years are the biggest, most meaningful reforms in generations. On the zoning side, that's absolutely the case with MBTA communities and accessory dwelling units. So I would say big wins there, still the impact of which still hasn't been completely felt, but all very, very positive. I think, on one hand, I think we've seen some great leadership, But the problem, the hole we're trying to dig ourselves out of is so deep. There's a lot more we have to do. And what's encouraging over the last year is we have two major bills that are in play. Yes in My Backyard and Yes in God's Backyard, which were led by Senator Crichton and Representative Vargas. And those bills were sort of amalgamated into a bill that came out of the Joint Committee on Housing a few weeks ago, just before the holidays, that is very, very strong, and also includes recommendations from an Unlocking Housing Production Commission that the governor appointed, that I was a member of, and we reported out about 50 policy recommendations in February that create kind of a roadmap for increasing housing production. So a lot of really good ideas at play now, bold ideas at play, but we just have to see them through. And that's where crunch time in the legislature really matters, because not all this stuff is comfortable. There's some pushback on what happens locally. Politically, that can be difficult, but if we don't solve that problem, we are in a tough spot economically.
Yeah, I'm going to get back into kind of those sorts of tensions. I'm glad you mentioned the housing bill, because by the time listeners are hearing this, I will have spent the last few weeks writing about that housing bill and the YIGBY and the YIMBY and inclusionary development and all of those lovely weedy subjects. So there will be things to plug and cite to, but let's pivot over for a second. On the education side of it, Jennie, you noted that there is this sort of sense that perhaps these issues are intractable, sort of inherent, sort of unaddressable. What does that actually look like in practice? What does it look like if state lawmakers are not kind of grappling with the problem with the sort of gravity that you would expect?
Well, I think it means that our kids continue to fall behind, and that is obviously something we cannot afford to do. But like I said, I do think that we have a legislature and a governor who care deeply about education, and it's been clear from all the investments we've seen over the past couple of years. And I also think they have made some notable strides in other areas, just outside of more funding. I said earlier that we really need to get back to the basics, and what I mean by that is we need to start by addressing our state's literacy crisis. Right now, only 40% of Massachusetts third graders can read proficiently. And when you break that down by student group, the picture becomes even more alarming. And we know why that's a problem. Literacy is foundation for all learning. And if a student can't read by third grade, every subject becomes more harder, and the odds of long-term academic success begin to plummet. And we also know that a major driver of this crisis is that too many school districts in Massachusetts are still using outdated and disproven approaches to teaching children how to read. Now, the good news is that the state leaders have begun to take notice and act. The governor initiated literacy launch a couple of years ago, or I think it was last year, that has been providing resources to districts to help them transition to evidence-based reading curriculum. And there's also a bill moving through the legislature that would require all districts to use evidence-based literacy curriculum. And so we were tremendously grateful and excited to see that the House passed this bill recently. It was passed in a unanimous vote, and the bill is now before the Senate, and I think there's real momentum behind it. So I would say one of the first things that I think the legislature needs to do in 2026 to try to address some of these intractable issues is to pass this literacy legislation as soon as possible.
And kind of sticking with you for a second, Jennie, what is your sense of the appetite for that? You mentioned that, of course, they seem to care very deeply about it. It is no secret, I think, to anyone that they have a lot on their plate right now. There are just compounding crises. So where do you think this kind of sits in the priority list?
Well, I think the fact the House took it up and had 155-0 vote shows that the House is very committed to it. We've also heard signals from Senate leadership that this is a big priority for them too. We can't have a first in the nation education system if our kids can't read properly. And so I'm very hopeful that this is at top of the list for the beginning of 2026. I think for a couple of years, there have been some questions over the extent to which this bill represents an unfunded mandate. Like I said, the governor has been putting a lot of money into literacy launch. There's also free curriculum that meets this criteria. So I think that question is very much being addressed. And then I also think there was a little pushback initially about the extent to which this undermines local control, but this bill really doesn't do that. What it does is it basically says to districts, you can choose the type of curriculum that you want to use as long as it meets these quality standards. It's really a quality control bill, if anything. And so I am hopeful that this is top of the list for legislators this coming year, among other things.
As soon as you said that, my ears perk up. Clark knows exactly where I'm going on this one, which is the MBTA communities housing law that we've talked about briefly, which requires cities and towns near public transit to zone for more multifamily housing near it, is currently being challenged back up at the state's highest court again for whether or not it is an unfunded mandate, because the state can't, as a rule, say that cities and towns have to do something without also providing a mechanism if it's going to impose a cost burden. And the reason I bring that up, Clark, is because we were sort of looking at those tensions there between what lawmakers might be interested in and then kind of what cities and towns or housing groups might be interested in. So before I kick it over to the mayor to see how he's feeling about those dynamics at the moment, why don't you tell me how you're feeling about those tensions, the local control question, and to what extent the state should be stepping in?
We at MHP, we helped, there are 177 cities and towns subject to the law. We helped somewhere around 150 of them with direct technical assistance, consultant, all kinds of support, which is the reason I have no doubt the SJC will uphold the lower court decision finding that the law is not an unfunded mandate. There was enormous support for cities and towns to comply with the law. The positive part of the story around local control, and I think this goes beyond housing, is there was really a sea change. I think there were some communities that were very cynical in their compliance and adopted districts that they really knew would likely not result in any new housing. In our experience, most communities comply with this law in good faith, and people came out of the woodwork in some of these suburban communities to say, okay, this is a reasonable thing, promoting more housing near transit, allowing more multifamily housing. Let's make the best of it. Let's do this in a way that makes sense for our community. So in our view, there's really a sea change, in the local politics, and there are hundreds of people who became involved locally who had never been involved with housing before. So I think there's something there we can build on, where local voters, local officials kind of understand we're part of a commonwealth, and we can't have communities, cities and towns can't be islands working at cross purposes with our needs as a commonwealth. And I think MBTA communities was kind of a breakthrough on that front.
So exactly to that point, Mayor, do you feel like an island out there? What's the water like? What are the transportation routes, the communication routes? Do you feel like we're in a healthy place as far as state versus local control, or have you been worried about some of those dynamics?
Well, I don't feel like an island. I feel like I have a great partnership with the Healy Driscoll administration. Our community does, and they've been very supportive. I'm certainly mindful of the tension, but I live in a community where the cost of housing is my residents' number one concern, and to see that as a regional issue, it's become a national issue, not be addressed because of sort of untenable commitment to a status quo that has failed us is really frustrating. And so I'm excited about the progress we're making. I served on the governor's housing advisory council that created the first statewide housing plan, I think, in some time, maybe ever, and see that as real progress. This idea that the government is undermining communities, I think, is sort of misunderstanding what zoning is. I mean, zoning is an infringement on individual property rights. And I say that as someone who believes strongly that we have a good zoning ordinance that does the right thing. But it's in some ways giving more control back to the people in what they want to do with their communities, for their communities. And we were happy to embrace it. We actually already had very permissive zoning. In downtown Lynn, we have by right 10 stories, no parking requirement. So one thing I do worry is that there's too much of this idea that it's just zoning that's holding us back. Because we've had this permissive zoning for some time, and there's still plenty of land that we think needs to be redeveloped. And I also would say that it's not like the state's going to get it right every time. When the MBTA communities legislation was implemented by the administration, there were some misses, and we had some back and forth about our interest in promoting mixed use communities, so preserving the ability to have retail on the ground floor and housing above it. Our commitment to doing a evidence-based but important inclusionary zoning policy that was potentially going to be limited by the way in which they had implemented the regulations. And we had a dialogue and a back and forth, and we were able to do what we felt like was fair for our community. So as long as that back and forth continues to happen, I think we're moving in a positive direction. You know, my Senator Creighton worked on the YIMBY bill, which Clark mentioned. I think there's a lot to be excited about in there. I think there's more back and forth that needs to happen. One of the things I worry about is that we absolutely want to produce housing. We have a very ambitious and aggressive goal around that, but we also need industrial growth and commercial growth, and we want to make sure that remains balanced as a community, because it's important for our tax base. It's important for our residents' ability to have good paying jobs, and so those are ongoing conversations that I'm sure will continue in this year.
And so sort of connecting these topics here, one of the questions around education, of course, is also the physical infrastructure. You mentioned, Mayor, of course, the difficulty of kind of building these new schools. They're very expensive to kind of keep them up to sort of modern levels. They can be very delayed. There's often questions about capacity, where they're located, who they're for, all of that. So, Jennie, how are you feeling about kind of the physical infrastructure around education right now, and given that the state has taken some steps to adjust the way that those can be kind of built and paid for?
Yeah, I think we've been making some positive steps. There was a recent report that just came out from Mass Inc. that highlights some of the ongoing challenges that we face when it comes to infrastructure and the way that the resources have been allocated, that there are many communities in gateway cities in particular that haven't necessarily been receiving an adequate amount of funding to upgrade their buildings. And so I think that is definitely another challenge that lawmakers are going to have to address this session as well.
All right. Well, I'd like to sort of make sure that we have the rest of this conversation as sort of a pure look ahead here. So starting with Clark, why don't you tell me kind of if there's one policy move. We talk about the MBTA communities law as sort of a big swing that was sort of unusual, even though it was tucked into an economic development package. So it's a few lines of legislation that has sort of caused this huge hullabaloo, and we're still trying to kind of figure out its impact. But is there something like that you would like to see? Is there something that seems likely?
This will be a very nerdy answer. There are a number of things in the YIMBY bill and the Housing Committee's bill that are, would make whole topics of conversation. One of the things that I'm most interested in and we've been involved in is around infrastructure to support the housing we need. And there are the issues around our existing municipal infrastructure and WRA and who has access to those services is a whole set of issues. But there's also, especially in the suburban and smaller towns, an issue around local environmental regulations that are really indefensible. We have 351 different health regulations, 351 wetlands regulations. The idea that sort of scientific environmental regulation is being kind of invented at the local level in all these small towns just makes no sense. So I think we have a lot of work to do. We know how much housing we need. The mayor talked about the housing plan, which is a terrific roadmap. But then we have to figure out we have to support this housing, with infrastructure, and we have not been as a Commonwealth all over that as an issue in the way that we need to be. So I think I know that's sort of in the maybe in the weeds around housing, but it's really fundamental to meeting our goals.
I think I love a weedy answer. The question that I've been asking plenty of people, which I'll ask you as well, which is, how are you thinking about the different levers that state lawmakers can basically pull here? Inclusionary development is very interesting because it requires development at a certain scale to include a number of affordable units if it's residential development. But then, interestingly, that can be kind of controversial around pro-growth folks because it does reduce or is feared to reduce the number of overall units. So how are you thinking about if you pull on one lever, which might make it easier to build affordable units, where does the softening come from? Is that how you think about it?
Yeah, it's a huge tension, and the mayor spoke about both mixed use and inclusionary zoning and the MBTA communities, and there is no bright line answer there because if you have mixed use requirements that don't allow any housing to be built, that's not a win, or if you have inclusionary requirements that make housing infeasible, that's not a win. So I think finding that middle ground and fine tuning that middle ground based on what's happening on the ground, I think is really where this is at. Figuring out kind of in good faith with municipalities, how can we sort of find the sweet spot where we're really achieving these multiple goals, including getting a lot more housing built.
Gotcha. All right, Jennie, what are you thinking in terms of kind of the short-term possibilities in this legislative cycle that look promising?
Yep. I keep hitting home on that literacy bill. Hoping that gets passed. Also, I think the legislature is also in the process of considering a bill that would ban cell phone use in schools. The Senate passed a bill last year that would create a bell-to-bell ban with, of course, sensible exceptions. And I think there's strong signs that the House is preparing to take it up this session as well. And I think that is a really encouraging development because we obviously cannot close learning gaps if students are constantly competing with their phones for attention. So I think doing those two things, we also need to pay attention to our math crisis. I could go on a whole dissertation on that, but I'll save you. Also answering the question around statewide graduation standards. We don't know if the legislature will act on that this session yet. A lot depends on what the graduation council proposes, but I think it's safe to say that these conversations are coming. But I would also just add that in 2026, when it comes to higher education, I'd really like to see the legislature continue to leverage fair share funds, which, as folks know, are required to go towards education and transportation explicitly, to continue to make strategic and targeted investments in public higher education. We know that by 2031, nearly 3 out of 4 jobs in Massachusetts will require some kind of degree or credential beyond high school. And we're fortunate to have a world-class public and private education system here in Massachusetts. But I think the challenge is that for too many students, college is still financially out of reach. Now, to be fair, the state has made real progress in recent years to address college affordability, expanding financial aid, launching free community college, which has been opening doors for thousands of students. But access is only half the equation. We do still see persistent completion gaps at our state institutions of higher education. And what I mean by that is too many students are enrolling in our public colleges, but never finish with the degree. And that's really a missed opportunity. So I think in 2026, in addition to those other priorities, I think it's the right moment for targeted investments in programs that help boost completion. Strong example is the Community College Success Program, which funds wraparound services for students in community colleges. And so I think increasing investments there would be a smart, high-impact step. Lastly, I think early college is also another initiative that has a lot of support and momentum in the legislature and the administration. And I think there's a bill that would expand and scale up early college programs across the state. I think the mayor can actually speak to what value early college programs have in the education landscape, but I'd also love to see the legislature really do something there as well.
Okay, all right. She teed you up, Mayor. It might not be the first on your list, but you get to kind of close us out here. What do you want to see the Massachusetts legislature spend its next, check my watch, 7 months or so on?
Great. Well, I appreciate that, Jennie. And we are so proud to be pioneering our early college program. We actually opened a whole new high school dedicated to early college, and related to the point that Jennie made around the Fixing Our Foundation report that came from Mass Inc., pointing out the challenges that cities face with financing school construction. We were able to open the school not by building a new building, but by repurposing a former office building that was being vacated. And in doing so and making some moves, we added 1,000 seats to our district, which is equivalent of a new high school, would cost maybe $300 million to build. We did it for essentially $30 million by buying these buildings and retrofitting them. We did that on our own, essentially. We went outside the process. And so I think underscores the need for the state to take up those recommendations in the Mass Inc. report about fixing our foundation and addressing the challenge of school construction in urban communities. I think a huge priority when we think about the year ahead has to be thinking about the impact the Trump administration is having on our residents. One sort of specific, more behind the scenes impact is that communities like Lynn with a large immigrant population have seen a drop in enrollment in students because of various reasons. So Lynn, Chelsea, Boston, and that has implications for our school budget. And so we'd like the administration and the legislature to consider a funding mechanism to make up for the drop in enrollment, to sort of even it out with the idea that it's not necessarily is going to be permanent. The drop in enrollment is in part due to just a lower number of arrivals that have been previously happening in the last several years, and so we think that could be addressed. I think more broadly, when you think about the year ahead, and this isn't as specific to the legislature, but what is happening around our country in the way that ICE is striking fear into communities and hurting our residents is entirely unacceptable. We were experiencing a huge surge of activity in June, again in September. We see that moving around the country. We should be with the expectation that's going to come back to Massachusetts at some point. The Healy Driscoll administration, Attorney General Andrea Campbell have been terrific partners. But as we saw yesterday, there is nothing holding the federal law enforcement accountable. And that's a huge problem. I joined a group of mayors in June in calling on the U.S. Attorney to investigate ICE for potentially unlawful constitutional activity in the way in which they're racially profiling residents to take them. When they do the wrong thing, we won't be able to count on the federal government to hold them accountable. And like I said, the Healy Driscoll administration, Attorney General Campbell have been great partners, but we need to be prepared for that to continue to happen.
All right. I think that's a useful note to end on here, which is, of course, we talk a lot about the relationship between city and state, but there is sort of this looming broader question right now, which is where does Massachusetts sit as it relates to the rest of the federal government? So with that in mind, Mayor Nicholson, Clark, Jennie, thank you so much for joining me today on this very early morning call. I appreciate you being on the Codcast this week.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Mayor Jared Nicholson, Jennie Williamson, and Clark Ziegler for joining me here on the Codcast. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our production and theme music is by Charlie Cazella. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other people find us. And email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back in your ears next week.